had this happened to me about 5 years ago. At that time, I had a lot of crazy ideas about life and wasn't afraid to say them. This behavior put me in conflict with most people, especially those closest to me. Like my parents, we would butt heads at least twice a week. It was usually my fault. I wasn't just a loud idiot, but I was also a slob. Don't get me wrong, I bathed religiously and had overall great hygiene. I fell short when it came to picking up. Whenever I would buy something, I usually wadded up the receipt and chucked it on the floor. Just sloppy stuff like that. I didn't realize how fast that stuff added up. Before I knew that I couldn't see my floor. And to be honest, I didn't really care. Anyway, one day I said something very disrespectful to my folks. And my mom slapped me. She'd never touched me before. So I was a bit shocked. Instead of apologizing, I called or something I regretted, and this set my dad off. Some more words were exchanged, and he told me to get out. In my deluded brain, I thought this was no big deal. I'd crash my car until I had enough to get my own place. Then I never have to deal with their rules again. I had no clue how hard this is going to be. I grabbed my laptop and took off in my junky 1992 Civic. I worked that night as usual. Afterward, I laid down the back seat and tried to go to sleep. The parking lot lights made it hard, but I eventually managed to doze off around midnight. A bang and woke me up. It was a cop. I told him the situation, but he said I had to move on regardless. I moved on to the next place and the same thing happened. For the rest of the night, I hopped from place to place being told to move on every time. Needless to say, I got very little sleep. Finally, around 6 a.m., I got a few hours in the Walmart parking lot. Later that day, I went inside the store and bought a few things, including a cheap sleeping bag and blanket. I noticed I was starting to get a tad smelly, so I cleaned up in the bathroom sink. The cracks in my theory were already beginning to show. Even after my bath and a liberal application of deodorant, I still felt dirty. I took another nap until I had to go to work. I was worried my whole shifts someone would notice that I was wearing the same clothes as the day before. If they did, no one said anything. I headed straight for Walmart afterwards. This time I parked my car away from the lights, and I was much more comfortable now, and quickly fell asleep. Sometime in the night a noise outside woke me up. I assumed it was a cop, and when I stuck my head up. Instead, I saw a person rummaging through my glove box. He must not have seen me laying in the back. I was half asleep and more curious than scared as I should have been. I sat up and asked him what he was doing. This must have scared him. He jumped up out of the car and peeked down into the back. When he saw me, his eyes got real big. He pulled out a knife and began leaning into the car. By now, I was squeezed between the seats. When I saw the knife, I grabbed the door and attempted to shut it. He got his knife-wielding arm in the door and tried pulling it open with the other. I was fighting against it, pulling the door with both hands. This seemed to go on forever. I was about to lose my grip when I saw a flash to my left. All of a sudden, the guy yanked his arm out and the door slammed shut. I didn't realize what was happening until I noticed the second man standing outside and saw the knife guy running in the distance. The second man walked up to my passenger side window and asked if I was okay. I assumed I was safe now and stepped out. I thanked him for chasing the man off. He explained he had been gassing up his car and heard the struggle. He turned around and saw the night flashing through my windshield. The guy must have spooked and ran when he saw him coming. He asked what had caused the fight. And I explained that it was an attempted robbery. I had scared the guy and he pulled a knife. Then I explained my situation. He turned out to be very sympathetic. He'd said he'd been homeless a while after he left the army. And what he did next, I'll forever be grateful for. He offered his driveway to me. We were strangers, obviously. He didn't know me from Adam, but he believed every man deserved a safe place to sleep. During the day I was on my own. However, after work, I'd be allowed to park at his home. That way, I wouldn't be harassed by cops or worry about being wronged. I thanked him, yet again almost began crying. He introduced himself as Nathaniel. We shook hands and I followed him home. That night, I slept better than I had in a few days. I drove around that morning and thought about how terrible my life of freedom had been. And I was on the road to enlightenment, but it would take a few more days to reach my destination. And repeat the same pattern day after day. Wake up and take a shower with Nathaniel's water hose, drive up to get breakfast, hang out at Starbucks for the free internet until work, go to work and then drive back to Nathaniel's to sleep. Not until the fourth day did I go inside his house. Never asked before then. Neither of us knew the other, and I didn't blame him for his caution toward me. That fourth morning was Saturday, about 7 a.m. Nathaniel knocked on my window and invited me in to have breakfast with his family. I was a bit nervous to meet them. Introduced them to me, one by one. They were all very nice. We made small talk. And when we finished, his wife said I could take a shower. I almost broke down right there. This woman had never met me until this morning, and was treating me like a son. She reminded me of my mom actually. I was beginning to see how much I take my family for granted. After my shower, Nathaniel and his wife invited me to sit down and talk. And I was scared of what they'd say. I shouldn't have been, which is talked about my situation. And they asked what I had planned, moving ahead. I wasn't sure honestly. Nathaniel did give me a great piece of advice. He asked if I thought my relationship with my parents was salvageable. And I figured it was. He recommended to patch things up with them. He said he'd had a rocky history with his father. He'd always intended to reconcile with him, but he died before that could happen. He says he wishes every day that he didn't wait. Even if I decided that didn't want to go back home, I should at least tell them that I was sorry. I thanked them for the advice and all their hospitality. And later, as I sat there at Starbucks, I thought a lot about how I treated my folks. It wasn't until that morning that I realized how lucky I truly was. And I decided I wanted to go home. Not so much for comfort's sake, but more so my parents would know that I was safe. At least that's what I told myself. That evening, I called them. My mother answered and made sure to apologize right away. I told her all that I've learned over the last week. I didn't mention the knife thing. I didn't want to scare her. Then I asked to speak to my father. I apologized to him also and said most of what I told my mother. Only then did I ask if I could return home. And then he said, "Of course you can. If my son, and we love you." I broke down right then. I thanked him for being such a great father, and I said that I was on my way. I learned a lot, and that week away from home. In my hometown, there exists a neighborhood of old houses caught in a limbo between opulence and poverty. For several blocks in the eastern section of town, some of the finest homes ever built stand as reminder for better time. Better not only in the history of the neighborhood, but the city itself. From 1905, when the first home was built, until the late 1970s. That neighborhood was the most affluent in the state. Alas, as the century drew to a close, it slowly became encircled by hordes of the less fortunate people some may call the dregs of society. Although most are actually hard-working human beings living paycheck to paycheck, their immoral neighbors often overshadowed them with their repeated criminal acts. As so often happens, many of those who call the neighborhood home for most, if not all, of their lives, fled to safer parts of the city. Despite this, there still exists a few families determined not to let their historic area fall to the barbarians at their gates, so to speak. And this is where it becomes a small part of this much larger story. I attended an arts magnet high school near the center of the city. My senior year, I met and fell head over heels for a girl about a year behind me. Her piercing blue eyes and dark black hair melted my icy heart instantly. We did it exclusively for the next 2 years until I transferred to a university out of state. Her and I had been together around 4 months when I was invited to a party at her house. It was a July the 4th barbecue her family held every year. And she told me where they lived. I got a little intimidated. The house just so happened to be one of the most historically important in the neighborhood. I was afraid her parents wouldn't like me because of my background. This turned out to be a foolish concern on my part. They were actually very nice pair of people and treated me like one of their own. Upon my arrival at the house, I realized the photos didn't do it justice. It was far larger than any home I'd ever been in, and the architecture was breathtaking. My girlfriend showed me around, then led me through to the backyard. The barbecue had just begun, the smell was heavenly. While I waited for the food, I met almost everyone. I'd estimate that there were around 100 people in attendance. Everyone I met that day treated me as a social equal. My nervousness soon faded and I had a good time. At least until the festivities were rudely cut short. I was making my way to get another soda when I heard a loud argument. It took a second to find the location. I noticed everyone was looking at the back wall. Only then did I realize the voices were coming from the alley running behind it. The guests tried to ignore the yelling and continue talking amongst themselves. I admit my curiosity got the best of me. I moved as nonchalantly as I could toward the wall. I could tell both voices belonged to men and one sounded very intoxicated. The longer it went on, the louder and louder the talking got. I could see by their expressions the hosts were getting uncomfortable. My girlfriend joined me and apologized for the ruckus. Just then loud bang quickly followed by 2 more exploded from the alley. Most everyone instinctively crouched down. I took my girlfriend by the arm and followed the others into the house. A few of the older ladies were a little shaken up. Their husbands did their best to calm them down while we waited for police to arrive. I couldn't believe something like this was happening in such a nice neighborhood. I overheard the others talking, and they sounded the same. I must commend the police for arriving quickly. They asked their questions and allowed us to leave not long after. Despite my shock, I was eager to know exactly what had happened. After leaving the house, I circled around toward the alley. I pulled over and watched the police to their work. One sheet and the shape of the person laid stretched on the ground. Tape was blocking both ends of the alley. Nothing was clear from my position, so I left after 15 minutes. I continued south in the same road and passed through an area I'd never experienced. As far as the eye could see, the businesses, mainly pawn shops and liquor stores, had iron bars covering every bit of exposed glass. A man staggered down the street arguing with an invisible adversary. A little further on, a woman wearing a very short skirt leaned inside a car and talked to the driver. I can only assume that she was lady of the night, as standing 2 blocks over, 2 other scantily clad women. The shooting made much more sense now. I'd grown up in a blue-collar neighborhood. I was aware of bad stuff happening, but social decadence on this level and out in the open was something I'd only seen in movies. It existing so close to a world of affluence and beauty turned everything upside down. It was the most literal example of haves and have-nots I've ever witnessed. I wouldn't have to wait long to hear what happened. That night on the 10 o'clock news report gave all the salient facts. The shooting apparently spawned from an argument over drugs. One man, a homeless addict, felt that he had been cheated by the other. When the homeless man confronted the drug dealer, a heated argument broke out, said argument, and with the death of the homeless man. The dealer fled soon after the shooting and was still at large at the time of the story. I couldn't help but feel sorry for the dead man, drug addict or not. Fortunately, the shooter was caught and later convicted. From what I've heard, the violent crime rate has only grown since then. Everyone in the area, rich or poor, seems to be suffering. Unfortunately, in things such as this, it seems everyone loses. Barely had a job a week when I met Wallace. I think I'd seen him around town before. Although I'm not sure, the homeless are not my primary concern when I'm busy doing errands. He seemed like a nice guy, more of a gentleman than I expected from someone in his position. I did my best to treat him with respect. He was still a human after all, and our initial problems stemmed from his hygiene. His breath was overpowering, and his overall smell sometimes made me gag. 5 days out of the week, I saw him, I kept my distance, and talked to a minimum. We got along as well as I did with any of the other regulars. I had noticed his growing infatuation with me at the time. I'd never been the type to make eye contact. Perhaps I would have caught on if I was how he got the crazy idea that I was interested in him. I can't possibly fathom. I was a 23-year-old girl and he was at least 50. Even if he didn't smell like a garbage can, he and I would never have been involved. It couldn't have been more than a month before the flirting began. It was tame at first, but as time passed, he grew far bolder. I can't remember one time that I encouraged him and I laughed at something he said. And he took this as a sign of approval. Probably never know. Regardless, the flirting got so bad, I had to scold him. And he didn't take this very well. The following Monday, another employee told me that he had said that I was leading him on. I laughed it off at the time, but was secretly kind of worried. That afternoon, he didn't have much to say. I was fine with this, and hoped things would return to normal. However, after a few days, the sickening smile and flirting would return. The day he touched me was the final straw. I yelled at him and he bolted from the store. My manager, who was already well aware of the situation, ran out of her office. I explained that Wallace had attempted to put his arm around me. My skin still crawls every time I think about it. After that, he was banned from the store where I was working. It felt like a massive weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Now, I realize how naive that must have been to think the problem was over. It would actually become far worse. I wouldn't see Wallace in the store after that. It appeared that he was following the rules. Another week went by before I noticed him walking up and down the sidewalk directly across the street. I initially got worried, but after a while he disappeared and I figured I was overreacting. I went on with work and didn't see him for the rest of my shift. That night, as I locked up by him, looked around, but he was nowhere to be seen. The short walk to my apartment went on as usual. A few people milled around, but the area was quiet. Once that was inside, I took a shower and dropped down on the couch. I resumed the show that I was watching, must have fallen asleep. A noise from outside woke me up a little later. It sounded like a man yelling. I sleepily stumbled to the window and peeked out, and was the worst thing I could have done. Down below stood Wallace. He was staggering around yelling my name. When I opened the curtain, he looked right at me. I tried closing it, but it was too late. Now he knew where I lived. He began laughing and walking up the stairs. As you get closer, I could tell that he was very drunk and never seen him like that before. His words chilled me to the bone. He said that he was tired of my games. He was going to teach me a lesson whether I wanted it or not. There was no doubt what he intended to do now. I ran from my phone and dialed 911. The operator asked me the usual stuff. I told her a man had followed me home and I was almost positive he intended to force himself on me. She told me officers were on the way. A loud bang came from behind me. Wallace must have been inside my apartment now. The bang happened again. I realized he was beating on my window. His words, despite being slurred, now had me in a near panic. His voice had an unbelievable tinge of evil to it. He began banging harder and harder on the window. I was afraid that it would break any second. I was in full panic mode now. I heard a woman screaming and realized that was me. I must have been ranting at the operator. She was doing her best to calm me, but the pounding, combined with his disgusting words, had driven me over the edge. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. I turned toward the window, believing it to burst. It was still intact. A struggle had replaced the pounding. I dared to look out just outside my door. On the landing, 3 police officers were fighting to get Wallace under control. He was lashing and cursing at them, battling to get free. I was terrified he was going to get away and almost screamed as I watched one of the officers finally shot him with his taser. Only then were the other two able to get him under control. They slapped handcuffs on him and drove him away to the patrol car, and I almost broke into tears. The relief I felt was unimaginable. One officer stayed behind. He knocked on the door and assured me that they had Wallace in custody. He opened the door and welcomed men. I felt bad for him. He had a cut on his forehead from the struggle. Now I asked if he was okay, but he shrugged it off. We were soon joined by a female officer. We sat down and I explained the whole rotten road that had led to this. I looked down on my hands and I noticed that I was uncontrollably shaking. I quickly sat on them so the officers wouldn't see. A paramedic arrived a few minutes later and asked if I needed him. I didn't, of course, and told him no. He treated the officer's cut. Well, I spoke to them. I tried to relax after they left, but my heart continued pounding until dawn. Although I didn't get much sleep at night, I still went into work that evening. My manager tried to send me home after I told her, but I refused. She stayed with me until close, I guess, to watch over me. She gave me a ride to home afterward. I do appreciate her concern. We still speak to each other on occasion. And it's been nearly 10 years. And she still treats me like a mother. She attended the trial every day with me. Her testimony did a lot to ensure Wallace's conviction. I think my situation scared her a little. She could have easily been the focus of his madness instead of me. I've since moved away from the city in which this took place. I'm not sure what had become of Wallace. Honestly, I hope he's turned his life around and sober. He could be a good man. It only goes to show you how bad your life can become if you let alcohol take control. And Wallace's case, and not only took everything he had, it almost took everything from me too. It's had to have almost been 20 years since this happened. I've had a severe head injury in between now and then, so it kind of can't remember a few of the smaller details. Nonetheless, the major points of that night will always stay with me. At the time, I worked for a local paper as a route courier. I was the guy who stocked the machines and provided papers to grocery stores. Nothing was different about that night as far as I can recall. I'd hit my first set of machines and was dropping off papers at the stores. I'd usually shoot the breeze with a few overnight cashiers at Kroger's for around an hour. He'd take his break and we'd smoke a bowl or three in my car. Kroger would normally mark the halfway point of my night. After leaving there, I'd cross over to the eastern side of town to my other set of machines. I was headed that way when I happened to notice them. Off to my right, maybe 30 yards away, I caught sight of three men running toward an alley. The closer I got, the easier it was to suss out what was happening. In actuality, two men were chasing another man. I have no clue why he ran into the alley, but he did. He slowed to turn the corner and they caught up with him. One, then the bigger of the two, punched the victim in the back of his head. The victim fell and his attackers began kicking him. I didn't know the reason behind the fight, but I didn't like the odds. I pulled into a nearby gas station and ran toward the alley. When I was within 20 yards, I yelled at the pair to stop kicking the man. They've made their point. They ignored me and continued kicking. I drew my pistol and fired into the air and began carrying it soon after getting the job because I was handling a large amount of change from the machines. And I didn't have a permit to carry, but my feeling of safety outweighed any legal issues for me at the time. They looked up with their first shot. When I fired a second, they ran off and out of sight. The man laid still on the ground. I ran up to him and checked his pulse. He was still alive, but blood was coming out of his nose and ears. I knew that couldn't be good. I carefully rolled him over onto his back. That's when I first noticed who he was. He was a homeless man that I'd often saw while working my route and even spoken to him a timer till I've slipped a $5 into his pocket once so he could get some food. He never asked for it. That's probably why I gave it to him. At this moment, who he was wasn't important and he needed help. And he needed it soon. I ran back over to the gas station and called 911. The ambulance arrived first. I will add them over to him, and they went right to work. The cop showed a minute later, but from the start, they didn't look happy. I told them what I'd seen in the directions the attackers had fled. I left out the gun part. Of course, once the cop said something like they had done the old guy a favor. I didn't find it funny, and I told him so. The second cop spoke up and seemed a little kinder. After they took my name and other info, they said that they'd give me a call if they needed me. The paramedics loaded the man quickly into the ambulance and sped away. The officers returned to their car without even a thank you. They pulled away, took the first left, and disappeared into the night. I was left standing alone in a parking lot at 3 a.m. The entire intersection with the emergency services only lasted 10 minutes, max. I was a little confused. While I appreciated their quick reaction, I got the impression no one cared about the victim, especially the first officer. You can probably guess that I never heard from the police, even called the hospital find out the victim's fate. But they wouldn't tell me. I didn't see him around after that. So I assumed that he may have passed. The entire episode gave me a dim view of mankind. Although never change the way I treat my fellow man. I'll never expect the same show of kindness from anyone else ever again. Way back before I was married, I volunteered at several homeless shelters in California. I don't always intend to go back once our kids started school. Well, you know how life gets away from us. I wouldn't be able to return to volunteering until both our children moved away for college. I don't regret making my kids my focus all those years. But nevertheless, once I had the time to myself, I felt the call to help very strongly. Our town didn't have any full-blown shelters. I did some research and found a position at one of the community kitchens. These organizations offer a hot meal for anyone who needs it, facilities to shower, even provide connections to programs that help them get off the streets. I'm proud to tell everyone I meet that I'm part of it. Unfortunately, even in a place full of so much hope, terrible things can happen. It was 2017 and I've been with the kitchen almost 2 years. In that time, thousands of faces passed in and out of those doors. Not until I met Hollis had I formed in the close relationships with our clients. This wasn't what you may think. We were not engaged in any physical relationship of any type. I saw him as almost a father, and I believed he viewed me like a daughter. Hollis wasn't an alcoholic or addict like many of his fellow homeless. He had fought in Vietnam. Upon returning stateside, he had a difficult time readjusting. Since he was unable to hold down any real employment, he soon ended up on the streets. He had been on and off of them multiple times over the years. He had once lived with a daughter for a short time, but they became estranged. I didn't ask what had caused the rift, but it did appear to sadden him any time it came up. I tried to convince him to call her a few times. But after he refused, the last time I didn't push the matter. In the end, it wasn't my business anyway. I was just there to help, and that the person doesn't want it. There's nothing you can do. Among the other regulars I saw on a daily basis, Barney was perhaps one of the worst. He was everything Hollis wasn't. I don't think there was an instance in which I spoke to him when his breath and reeked booze. He tried to bully the other clients, and several of the women told me that he tried to force himself upon them. I didn't like the man, but I did all I could to help them just as I would any of the other visitors. He'd sometimes tried to kiss up to me, often flashing his toothless grin and telling me how pretty I was looking that day. I ignored his behavior. I just assumed he was doing it to get something. I wouldn't find out until later that his motivations came from a much baser place. September 25, 2017 was a day just like any other. The morning had seen a brisk turnout and we expected the same for dinner. I was cleaning up in the dining room when Hollis came in. We had a brief conversation and I gave him a short hug before he left. It was something I'd done countless times. I returned to the kitchen and began prepping for that evening. About an hour passed and I heard screaming coming from the activity room. Roman, our head cook, volunteered to check it out. I stayed behind at his behest, and no more than a minute later, he ran back to the kitchen. He was short of breath and acting panic. As soon as he could speak, he said Hollis had been stabbed. He was dead. I didn't believe him and ran out to see for myself. On the floor lay Hollis with a pool of blood surrounding him. A couple of women were crying nearby, and most everyone was staring with shocked faces. He wasn't moving, and only then could I accept the truth. I collapsed his feet, joining the others and weeping, and the paramedics arrived within a few minutes and whisked him away. We all knew that there was nothing they could do. Only then did I ask who had done it. More than one witness pointed at Barney. I looked around for him, but they said that he'd walked out after the stabbing. I'd always known he was a bully, but I'd never known him to be violent. When asked for the reason, no one answered me at first. They all had guilty looks on their faces. I then demanded they tell me. Finally, one of the women nearby said, "Well, man, Mr. Wallace came into the room and Barney got in his face. He said something like, 'Don't you dare touch her again. She's mine and you know it. Don't you ever lay hands on her again.' I mean, Mr. Hollis laughed and asked Barney who he was talking about. Barney then said, 'Well, you know well, who? Booker Jennett in the kitchen.' This made Mr. Hollis roar out in laughter. He put his hand on Barney's shoulder and said, 'You're right, Bates.' And he laughed even louder. And this made Barney furious. He pulled a knife out from his pocket and stabbed Mr. Hollis. Mr. Howell has dropped dead where he stood. And Barney turned around and walked out calmly. I was speechless. No idea what to say. Marty never gave me a reason to believe he was obsessed with me. Certainly not enough to kill. I sat down, began bawling again. My hands over my face in shame. The idea of being the cause of Hollis's death was horrifying. It seemed like hours before I could get it together. By then, words were filtering in that Homeless had been pronounced dead upon arrival at the hospital. It wasn't a shock. Once the police decided I was free to leave. One of the other volunteers drove me home. I was still a mess and useless to the kitchen. Even as late as bedtime that evening, I cried myself to sleep in my husband's arms. I took a few days off to decide if I was continuing at the kitchen. During that period, I was happy to hear Barney had been arrested. I've heard he told the police it was self-defense. But I know for a fact Hollis didn't have a mean bone in his body. Doing it in front of a roomful of people didn't help his case either. He wisely took the sentence that he was being offered and most likely will die in prison. After the funeral, I decided to return to my job at the kitchen. I don't think Hollis would have wanted me to give up on helping people. I won't lie. It's been hard working every day without Hollis being around. Knowing everyone knows the reason why. I know I would have been miserable if I hadn't. While returning to work has been difficult, forming any bonds with the clients. Well, that part has been far harder.